from relatively different disciplines with different takes on esports and the policies that it should have. And so we'll be talking about developing a global policy for esports and kind of the significance that that has and the purposes that that aids in the development of esports. So just going to work my way down the panel and maybe talk a little bit about the significance of global policy for esports and maybe the way in which each of you interact with that. So starting with you, Justin, talking a little bit about the policies for esports that you and KeSPA have developed and the significance that a global policy for esports has.
Well, basically, as I talked in the presentation before, most of the policy comes from the government's funds. If an esports needs to be recognized and developed further on, a government is an essential part of that policy to provide those financial funds in developing tournaments, events, and player rights and interest on that area. And of course, as I talked before, the infrastructure is a major part that a policy needs to be implemented in as various areas, which Korea was one of the foremost improved area in the esports area, is esports industry. There must be an infrastructure of developing PC banks around the world, which I believe that needs to be implemented to other areas as well on developing this environment where everybody can interact with each other and play games together in all those areas as well.
So you're talking about developing kind of the infrastructure
Yes.
that develops this, but what kind of policies are important to encourage not only that infrastructure, but the growth of esports as a whole?
It's a broad aspect, I guess, on this part. But I guess on the global policy itself, very broad.
It is very broad. So maybe specifically, what are some of the significant policies? You mentioned the infrastructure being important, but what kind of policies has KeSPA worked to enact to encourage the development of esports here in Korea?
Well, so the businesses that I talked before in the presentation was the esports PC clubs. Even though there are so many PC banks in the Korean region, they are very undeveloped. They're not consistent on the tournaments and events for players and teams. So what we did is that we initiated the esports PC clubs on designating certain areas where they can improve towards an amateur scene, provide that scene where players can become pros in the end. All those businesses that we do. Also with the international cooperation of hosting events and tournaments that foreign players can invite, we can invite and nourish those events together. It's just the StarCraft tournament that we had last year on that aspect, yeah.
So that's a way in which policies have been developed locally here in Korea, and I guess extrapolating that to a global sense when either developing nations or nations looking to develop a policy for esports.
So most areas, everything starts within Korea itself. However, later on it develops into the international scene. First, we must develop ourselves on what the policy is. We got to develop the policy in becoming a better esports area for other international regions to come in and exchange those ideas together.
All right, moving on to Mr. Webster. You've worked very extensively with the South African government in your role with Mind Sports, but maybe talk a little bit about some of the importance of developing policies for esports both locally there in South Africa and then extrapolating that to what kind of esports policies are important to develop globally.
Yes, thank you very much. Well, while Mind Sports South Africa is, of course, the national federation and looks after national policy, the way that Mind Sports South Africa actually sees it is to look towards the international federation, IeSF, to actually create the global policy, because it's not something that a nation can do by itself. In order to create global policy, you need a large working together of a number of different nations in order to come to a common goal, to create a common vision, in order to create that policy, which Mind Sports South Africa just basically then reenacts into its own policies inside South Africa. So we're not looking at creating global policy, but rather saying, well, what does IeSF do for us? How do they create their global policy? And that's the global policy that we take and enact. and we see that assists us enormously at home. It helps us create the promotion back home for the National Federation, in that we can interact on a competitive level against other countries, that we can actually have best practice, that we can take back and adopt ourselves. Not everything we do is right. And in fact, there's a lot of things that other people do that from which we can learn. And that's the importance of having a global policy created by an overarching body like IeSF.
Thank you. That was very concise. Moving on to Sung from Rossetti. In your presentation on developing the esports arenas of the future, which is your speciality, as you move from the general architecture of maybe more traditional sports arenas to adapting them for the viewing experiences of the future, including esports, specifically regarding esports global policy, what is it that would be helpful for you when it comes to global esports policies as you look towards developing the esports arenas of the future?
So before really answering your question, one thing that I want to mention is what's happening in the traditional sports. Mm-hmm. For example, IOC or the FIFA or IAAF or all those organizations or committee, along with the NBA or NFL or the professional league, those organizations have their own the policies or standard for their facilities, the venues. This similar way that basically helps us to bring the ideas and designs to make really giving the benefit to all the user groups. Let's say the 4 different user groups, like the fans or the players or the teams and the media and the operators. The top of everything, the life safety is the biggest issue. Without having those kind of policies established, anybody can build, in their own way, which will jeopardize very basic, the fundamental, which is the life safety. So the life safety always has to come the first, beyond everything, whether it's fun or whether it's a good design, or regardless, the life safety should come first. And on top of that, those kind of policies, giving us some sort of direction. We are not just doing everything all on my own. I mean, there should be some sort of guidelines, and everybody has to follow that gives the lots of the benefits to all the stakeholders, including all the user groups that I mentioned. So that that way, the esports can grow together for the better the experience, not only in front of the PC or their living room, but also in the venue side.
So when you look towards developing or adapting the experience that you have developing traditional sports viewing experiences, now adapting to esports, a lot of times there aren't those global policies that might define how you should implement your esports arenas. So how do you go about working towards building these experiences without all of these policies in place?
Again, going back to the user experience, whether it's fan or the players, the fan is kind of quite different, to unique in terms of giving the experience, because there are so many different types of experience for the fans. Someone likes to watch the esporting event on the screen, and someone wants to watch the events there, right next to the players. So you really cannot determine or giving the guideline how far you have to be from the certain action or the certain screen. But when it comes down to the player side, you really cannot do everything or just without having any directions. That way, the players, the teams, or those stakeholders are really having a benefit to make their best of the performance. The locker room, for example, or the players' lounge, for example. If you cannot provide those sort of very fundamental amenities, or the fan amenity, or the players' amenity, without having that sort of amenity, you cannot really guarantee those kind of performance and creating the great experience for the event.
Right, and maybe you have policies that decide all of that locally, but you're only one company doing one job, and of course globally they may not have that same thought process going into the design. So having a global policy for that would kind of standardize that and ensure things like the human safety and player safety and issues like that on a larger scale.
Right, and esports, for example, I think one of the very unique thing now it's not unique anymore because what I've seen from the esporting events in the venue, the interaction is really the huge experience. So the fans are having a good interaction with the players, and they are very close by while they're playing or even after, before the game or before the event. They really kind of high five together and mingle together and getting very close to the players. That's not really happening in the traditional sports in the past. But the traditional sports is also changing in a way that fan is engaging, sometimes physically, but more of the visually engaging to the players, which is a huge value. But esports, it has those kind of value already established. So we can think about how we can maximize those sort of unique esports experience into even further that the traditional sports is catching up right now.
Thank you. Moving on towards Kameyama-san down there at the bottom of our panel. As you look at esports as kind of a new and emerging, exciting experience, what are some of the highlights or characteristics of esports that are exciting to you in your role as a special advisor to tourism and events?
Well, just Son and Mr. Rossetti showed the presentation. The esports experiences are very much attractive to tourists, not only maybe fans, but also like me, who are not really, to be honest, not really interested in those games. But the excitement should be kind of one of the things that I'd like to experience as well. So in that matter, for the esports event, it very much have very big potential for tourism in the destination. So in that perspective, esports should be known or recognized as a great potential to the destinations. But there is a report published in August this year. It surveyed like 500 city destinations around the world, which were asked about esports events. And quarter of the destinations said the debate whether it is sport or not negatively influences their decision to hold the esports events, which is related to all the negative connotations which I mentioned yesterday as well. So I think that the esports industry still needs to change those perceptions from the society in general about esports.
Maybe Justin could speak a little bit to that.
Well, I guess as Kameyama-san already said in that part of the perception in the industry is that our local government itself is very concentrating on that part, on improving that perception that video games and esports are something that we can always cooperate together on and play together on. So with the example that I said before of the events that we do towards this theme, such as the Family Esports Festival that we do every year, we bring that cooperation between families or friends on bringing that experience of the interaction between the esports games. And I believe that it is necessary for the government to put that policy inside as a first priority, because due to the fact that if the perception of the esports is bad or video games are bad, nothing's going to be happening in the later end. Nothing's going to be starting. There's going to be no players or teams. There's going to be no venues on that side of the esports scene. So it's very important for the government to put that policy inside of that recognition of improvement towards the esports.
That's right. You might be able to see up here that even this event is sponsored by the Korean Tourism Organization. And several times when I've been working at esports arenas as a commentator within Korea, the tourism organization will also bring in guests, either international guests or families within Korea, as a way of showing them what the esports experience is like and giving them that exposure. And I think that's what you were talking about, Kameyama-san, about changing that perception of esports. Maybe not even having to combat an incorrect perception, but just showing and illustrating the potential that esports has, and allowing people to make maybe their new own perceptions about the way that it currently stands. So, Colin, I remember you were discussing in our previous panel some of the ways that you're going about changing these perceptions in South Africa. So maybe you could highlight a few of those points about the ways that you're working on changing that.
Yes, well, in order to change perceptions, back in South Africa, what we're doing is obviously working from grassroots support. A lot of the misperceptions are basically from an older generation that do not understand these sports. They see it as something of which to be afraid rather than something that should be embraced. But to change these perceptions, it's so important to have the global approach done to it, because it's through having an international body and having an international body that's attempting to achieve this level of accreditation that the national federation can actually put forward its own case at a lower level. Because people then look at it and they say, well, you know, it's not just here. If you start working only in your own backyard, you know, prophet's never recognized in his own village. It's actually easier to get that point across. So that global framework is absolutely vital to, in fact, even just deal with misperceptions back home. You have school governing bodies saying, well, you know, if this is an accredited sport by the National Olympic Committee, well, then that's fine, you know, obviously. But then how does it become affiliated to a National Olympic Committee? You see, you need to have your own affiliation to the international body. And your National Olympic Committee will be saying, well, what policies does the international body have that are going to actually support the view that this is a sport? So the global framework to change these misperceptions is absolutely vital, and it's vital for the members of such a body to actually share that vision and to act with almost one voice.
All right, so we've established the importance of having policies that do, you know, govern esports globally. But what is the way that we should go about establishing these sustainable and enforceable policies? I'll open that up to everybody on the panel.
Well, that is through interaction. Oh, sorry.
No, please.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
That's through interaction of all the parties concerned. You've got to involve everybody. You can't be exclusionary. You've got to get in the publishers. You've got to get in governments. You've got to get in all the stakeholders and actually see what is the best practice in order to put forward as a global framework. You can't go it alone because that just doesn't work. And then it's through that dialogue and that openness that you can actually perhaps mesh together some better understanding.
Well, I think that as Justin's presentation, Korea has already set a good example. I'm kind of surprised to know that Korea had the act of promotion of esports, not in this year, last year. It was established more than 10 years, right? And KeSPA was also established more than 10, it's like 2000. So it was quite surprising to me, but not many countries haven't done that yet, right? So Korea has set a good example, and many national federations can kind of follow the Korean examples, and Korea maybe lead other federations or countries to involve politicians or the government or the bureaucracies, so that not only the fans or industry people, but maybe we need to lobby or convince those seniors, adults, and politicians and bureaucrats to set promotion of act or that kind of organization to enhance the understanding of the esports.
And so,
Okay.
I believe I'm not the only one who's working on both sides, the traditional sports and esports. So when we really work, for the esports, we are always comparing to the traditional sports in many different ways. There are difference and there are the similarity. Especially for the venue side, there are lots of similarity in common. You gotta have certain structure and you gotta have a certain the components in the building which shares the esports and the traditional sports or even other entertainment events. So somehow we also have to learn from what already happened in the traditional sports to create a policy. And we have to refer to what's been done by the other sports, what's been done by the other organization. And that way we can sort of manipulate or tweak those sort of the policies from the traditional sports and adapting into the esports and making the esports unique policy, which also having good communication between the esports and the traditional sports. I think that way, even that's benefiting the esports to become, I shouldn't say really the part of the traditional sports, but part of the holistic sporting world.
So basically, I guess the sustainability is a really important part of this issue of the policy. One of the things that I want to re-emphasize is one of the steps that I explained in the PowerPoint earlier for the master plan according to the nurture and expansion of esports. One of the things is that I believe that every nations or every associations regarding this have this kind of policy regarding the selection of esports, a selection center for nurturing and diversifying this esports games. One of the reasons is because whoever knew that 10 years ago was when StarCraft was booming, that it would be on a downfall right now. Currently, League of Legends is one of the best games, or Dota 2 is one of the most highlighted esports games. But you never know that when it's going to be changing the infrastructure and everything. Out of the blue, where new games coming out, such as Battlegrounds, is rising up the scene. We always have to have those risks coming through our scene, and we gotta be always aware of the situations on making this scene possible. So I believe that the selection of esports and diversifying them and providing a support ground for these various games that might be coming out through our scene is an important factor where we can prepare for new games coming out and nourish that esports scene on producing various players and teams for that esports sustainability to be going on.
Yeah, nurturing sustainability, I guess, provides the actual content for whatever policies are interacted, however, locally or globally. There has to be a scene to have policies for. So nurturing that is obviously very, very important. Now, Sung, when you were talking about kind of the merging of the more like secular sports side and the esports side that is now sort of growing closer and closer together. Obviously, there are many, many global policies for the sports side, either specifically when it comes towards your development of sporting arenas and experiences, and now that too is growing closer and closer towards the esports side. So, what are global policies that you see enacted in the sports world that don't have a counterpart in the esports world that you would like to see?
Let's see. What can be done? Well, probably you have to give me a minute to think about.
Okay.
'Cause
I guess to clarify the question just a little bit, because sports and even earlier yesterday we talked about the Olympics specifically, many global policies, whether it's how you become a sport that is accepted into different tournaments or organizations, or the requirements for athletes, all exist on kind of a global scale just because of the scale of most traditional sports today. Well, esports is still growing in its infancy or adolescence or wherever you want to consider it, but certainly has not developed to the same extent. And as it continues to develop, what are, I guess, global policies that you see in place in sports, either specifically when you go to design an esports experience that you don't have for esports?
Yeah. I see the biggest difference between the esports and the traditional sports in the venue side is again, I keep kind of repeating the viewership or the viewing experience, and also how the events or the playing action is happening. So the playing action is happening on the floor, of course, in the event level, which is sometimes in the middle or sometimes at the end. But that is not really dictated by certain policy. And the policy cannot really tell whether you gotta have the events right in the middle or you gotta have event right at the end. From the fan side as well, I mean, you really cannot tell the fan where they are sitting or they're watching. And let's say if I want to make some example of what's been done for the traditional sports from the IOC perspective, for example, the Olympic venue, they have certain criteria for the Olympic family and how they arrive and then how they access and how the fan has to access to the venue and how they can exit. And even some of the league, the NBA, for example, they have some sort of, they are really the business driven beyond the certain standard. Some of the POS ratio, for example, POS is a point of sale. So the league is actually asking every venue having certain POS ratio, which is sometimes 1 to 200. So every 200 seating, the seat capacity, you got to have the one concession stands. But I don't know how we can adapt that sort of concept into the esports, because the esports is totally different in terms of the experience. So the esports, they are like the part of our presentation. We talked about the stay in action. So the baseball, for example, the baseball, even though they are playing like 2 or 3 hours, their really ball in action time is only 18 to 21 minutes. But the esports is totally different. So depending on the game, sometimes the kind of fighting game only lasts for 8-10 minutes. The League of Legends is like a 45 and 1 hour. So within those time periods, the 8-10 minutes or the 1 hour, the spectator really cannot leave the seat, just watching the game. How we can define those kind of the viewing experience or the attending experience to the event, then create those kind of policies, which I think even the determining factor or the baseline of the policy has to be a lot different from the traditional sports. So I think we got to have a different way of thinking to create a policy on top of the similarity from the traditional sports. So just the POS, for example, again, we cannot really starting from the same way of calculating the POS for the esports. So those kind of the quite different experience is telling us that how you can approach to create a policy for the esports quite different from the traditional sports.
Thank you very much, Sung. I believe that is all the time that we have for our panel, but I would like to turn things over to our very attentive audience for a few questions and answers for about 10 more minutes. So if you raise your hand in the audience, we'll be able to get you a microphone here in just a minute. So right there in the middle.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Nicholas from Singapore, the Federation for Singapore, and I want to congratulate KeSPA, I think, for the many years of infrastructure and foundation building.
Thank you.
I think many of your policies were made without the existence of global policies at that time. And I'm wondering if there are global policies that are set up. Would you change your policies to follow them, number one? And where, in your opinion, are the top 3 areas that you would perhaps adapt and change your policies to follow if there were international policies, right? Would it be like choice of game titles? Would it be tournament rules? Would it be standards and all that? I just wanted to hear your opinion. Thank you.
So I guess just to get a reiteration of that, a question you kind of want to know on which areas of the policies that you would like to change on for us part?
If there were international esports policies, would KeSPA, I guess, adhere to those, and which policies that KeSPA currently has might change if there were a larger esports, global standard?
Well, I guess basically what I believe the most when an esports starts is the infrastructure part that needs to be implemented to other countries as well. For example, I've given this example many times of, why Brazil is so good at soccer is because there's so many arenas, there's so many places to play soccer at in Brazil. The same goes for Korea, where you have so many PC bangs around the area that there has to be so many people playing at the same time. What I believe is that other countries, have to implement this idea of bringing that culture to those scenes and bringing that interaction between the gamers and cooperation and and bringing the culture into the scene is the really important factor of this scene. Of course, and further on, I guess the nurturing of the esports selection of various games is an important factor that I believe that should be implemented to other policies as well, and into the scene as this is my own personal opinion, I guess. The global policy itself, I believe that we currently have our own selection of criteria and standards and guidelines for the selection of esports games. However, what I believe towards is we have to make a global policy on where every country should follow that selection criteria on the selection of esports games, where all countries should accord in line of the selection of the same games together, which some countries are popular in these games, some countries are popular in these games. I don't think that's right. I think that every country has the same rules on the same games, which later on will be the same thing for the Olympics, where certain games will be selected for their certain criteria.
Right, so different games for different countries based on the interest that naturally develops there.
And the criteria that we select are those games that we need to put on the policy itself.
Thank you very much. Matt?
Yep, Sung, I'm going to put you on the spot. You asked the question about the difference between traditional sports and esports in terms of policy. One of the things that I've been curious about is the accessibility of players and performers, right? Or the players and the audience. It's one of the things that makes it so enjoyable. In traditional sports, they're segregated very carefully behind security. So how do you think that's going to change, and how will that change policy? This determines how you fly home, by the way.
Well, I have to answer pretty right way. Sorry, Matt, can you repeat the question again? I mean, I'm really...
Stall. Currently, in esports, there's a wonderful accessibility and relationship between players and the fans. That's probably going to change as they become rock stars like your average NBA player. Okay, so how do you see policy changing that in terms of their safety, security, and integration within the audience?
Well, I think that's going to happen for sure. like the traditional sports, we have seen the traditional sports in a way that the players are pretty much separated from the fans. I think that there are two different the reasons. One is like Matt said, it's really the safety or security issue, but also it's about the value issue. The players of the traditional sports, like a rock star, they're very, very valuable. So how the operator or the league can even take the benefit of having those values even more increased in a way that they can generate even more value. So esports is the same way. As the players becoming more and more popular and getting more of the popularity, and that, in other words, getting more of the value. So we gotta protect those kind of values in a way that the policy also support those kind of the value sort of protection at the same time protecting the security or the safety of the players. Like I mentioned earlier, for the Olympic family, there are many different reasons of having those kind of policies for the Olympic Games, but I think the same the policy applies to the players in a way that the players can be protected by having those kind of policies and making basically the safety for not only for the players but also for the fans as well. So that is very, very important, the items of the policy to determine how the venue has to be designed. So that's sort of benefiting everybody in the venue. Did I answer right? Thank you.
So the funny thing
so
is...
I got flight back, right?
So to add on to that, I guess, one of the funny thing is actually Korea itself. I'm wondering if any of you guys recently went to any of tournaments that we have, such as the LCK League of Legends Championship. What you can see is that there's already a phenomenon on the players becoming popular stars. Majority of the attendees of the tournaments are women. 80% of what we see is are women cheering on the players due to their popularity. But everything starts. We have this cultural way of seeing men attractive on those skill sets that they see. So if Faker is a very popular guy in this region, or Huni, yes, just like yesterday, because they're so good, they seem so attractive to those women. I believe that this phenomenon will go on to other countries with the skill set they provide to the same level as the Korean level do in these areas. So it's already a phenomenon that's already going on, and I believe that it's going to be developing as soon as possible when the esports scene is growing onto this part.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question before we go ahead and end things. So, see if we have any other raised hands.
Yeah. I think one of the biggest challenges for establishing global policy on esports is how fast esports change and evolves. So I wanted to ask Justin and just out of the panel, all of the panel as well, how has KeSPA dealt with this? Because you establish polish, and then you have new games coming, new rules, new way to deal with sponsors and governments, and it's probably keep going. I mean, for traditional sports, it's easier in a sense to establish policy because the source material is not changing, right? You get the sport, you get the rules, and that's it, and it stays the same for 100 years. But esports changes so fast, and it changes the way you deal with, excuse me, the way you deal with players, with sponsors, with governments may change when the games change, and games change really fast. So I would like to know how KeSPA has dealt with this with all the time you have been building this esports policy in Korea, how this experience can be applied to establishing global policy for esports.
Well, I guess, just to be really honest, in the past, we thought that StarCraft was going to be going on forever. And all these problems came up with all those illegal bettings and match fixing and all those kind of stuffs. What I believe that for a game to be sustainable in the first place, I believe the training, when a game is getting popular, there must be players and teams that are really skillful in these areas. And throughout this scene, they're going to get fans, they're going to be, getting some popularity around this area. But they might be getting, star addiction. I mean, they feel like they're celebrities, and you know, they do this bad stuff sometimes. So what is important is for our policy itself is, of course, what I implement is the training of the human resources. It's important to always teach these players on training them on the sportsmanship, on educating them on fraud preventions, and all these stuff are a very important factor in sustaining that game itself. The players and teams are the essential factor in how a game of esports is continuing to live on to its process. So I believe that training of human resources is one of the essential factors in this place.
Yes, and I think what's important with any sort of global policy is that, yes, some of it will be entrenched into rules and regulations, but what you'll find is that with every sport, there's always policy changes from a year-to-year basis. You see this in rugby, you see this in athletics. There's always a policy change, and it's something of which people should not be afraid. It's that large overview of policy that actually allows change to actually happen on a far more sustainable basis.
Thank you very much, Colin. And of course, thanks to all of our panelists. That's all the time we have for. So please give our panelists a round of applause.